This video is brought to you by BetterHelp.
Under Master Bib's watchful eye, Mos Espa was divided amongst 3 families.
Gambling. Everything here revolves around betting on those awful races.
What's up, Meta Nerds? This video is going to be a complete breakdown of Mos Espa, from the first settlers, their intentions, why they picked this spot, how Darth Plagueis and Gardulla the Hutt became the benefactors and sparked its boom to overtake Anchorhead, and its relationship with Mos Eisley and the galaxy as a whole. But first I want to thank this video's sponsor, BetterHelp. BetterHelp is not a crisis line, but nor is it fluffy self-help. It's professional therapy done securely online. A modern solution to barriers that have been with therapy since its inception. Now you can cut out all the transit time and rigid schedules of a physical office, using their app to connect you to their network of 20,000 licensed therapists from all over the globe. It is cheaper and more convenient, and you can start communicating in as little as 48 hours, with sessions being done through video calls, just normal phone calls, or even through text messages. Whichever you prefer, and you will be able to find a therapist that specializes in the particular issues you want to work on, all on a much more flexible schedule. And you can even send messages to your therapist at any time. And something that I did personally was I was able to change my therapist. It was really straightforward and simple. Again, all while being much more affordable than traditional methods, and financial help is available. BetterHelp wants to make therapy as practical and straightforward as possible. Start living a happier life today, be proactive, and head down to the link in the description, where you can get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/metanerds. That's betterhelp.com/metanerds. I really hope this can help whoever needs it, but let's get back to the video. Tatooine had been inhabited by the Jawa and Tuskens for longer than anybody could remember, and off-worlders have been here in small numbers since around 5000 BBY, with Anchorhead growing first. But it was mostly a collection of corporate mining towns run by the Czerka Corporation.
Welcome to Anchorhead, potential customer. Czerka Corporation stands ready to serve, after some formalities, of course.
As workers brought more industries like shops and cantinas, jobs and opportunity snowballed and brought more independent settlers. And gonk droids provided them the power to settle far off on their own homestead, and eventually establish their own cities. Don't worry, this won't descend into a theoretical physics lecture, but since gonks are mobile fusion reactors, they are the perfect homesteading hero, as they would only need a pinch of fuel, would last for hundreds if not thousands of years, and can be moved around like a little generator. This sounds extreme, but even Anakin grew up hearing that the gonks, quote, make the galaxy tick, as it was the only real way settlers could travel across the stars. Solar and wind may be viable, but they're too big, expensive, and short-lasting, when compared to the gonks' near indestructibility, long life, and economy of their fuel, which allowed for all your off-the-grid fantasies to come true, as settlers removed themselves from the crime-infested, morally bankrupt lower levels of Coruscant, and if you went far enough, you could even get out of the Republic as a whole. This is exactly what happened to the first settlers of Mos Espa in 800 BBY. Who would hook up the gonks to power the moisture vaporators, which were an incredibly simple technology, using the electricity generated to cool a tube that would interact with the scorching hot air, condensing to produce water. Now you just needed food with a long shelf life provided from your port traders, and you could always hunt local game like bantha, dewbacks, eopie, and womp rats. With the spaceports and Jawa's scavenging and ingenuity, you could make a civilization work here, and these free settlers, the non-Czerka related folk, would coalesce around this area north of the Junlan Waste, about 90 miles from Anchorhead, and a spot that was chosen for the same reason that we see the Lars family home built around this pit. It was much cooler, collected its own moisture, and with the city having these narrow canyon entrances, it was easier to keep out Tuskens. This pit could have been the result of mining, as this was one of the biggest pools to this world, and Czerka did dig some enormous areas out, sparking a mineral rush here, as you could pick up a really cheap detector and just wander the lawless world, hoping to pick up on some untapped vein of pricey mineral. So it could be an old mine, but I do think it looks more like a natural canyon. But however it started, once the city took off, there were enormous cave systems dug out into the walls, which had to be prime real estate here, a near zero threat of Tusken Raiders, and a great view, with all the benefits of living under the rock in a cool cave. The city streets would be lined with everything you would expect in a big city of the Inner Rim, if admittedly in a rougher shape. And you can see, even into the New Republic era, there are gonks and moisture vaporators everywhere. One of the few major cities in the galaxy with dense urban life, where almost every building is self-sufficient, a holdover from those rugged individualist roots. And as their pit filled, the upper sprawl extended further and further out. And it is in this part of the city that Qui-Gon hoped to find parts for their ship. He never even got close to the pit area of the main city limits, hoping to stay as anonymous as possible. And if you take a look here, and during the night with Maul scan, this whole area of Mos Espa, you can see pockets of cities, likely with their own nicknames or neighborhoods, but which all gradually connected to make this massive metropolis we see 40 years later. 100 years after Mos Espa was established, in the year 700 BBY, the Ba'omar monks arrived and constructed a palace far away from the settlements of Mos Eisley or Espa, reasoning that no matter how big those cities grew, this palace would remain far away from the involvement in any secular actions of Tatooine. Around 200 years later, Jabba the Hutt would take it over and make it the capital of his vice empire, and thus a major political center on Tatooine. Though he was about 500 years from being the true, universally recognized Lord of the Dune Seas. His biggest rival was Gardulla the Hutt, and she was less attracted to the Vice, more business-minded and cautious. While Jabba had his big palace on a hill, she had a hidden fortress in the Dune Sea, which took advantage of the terrain and locals, being so hard to find that when Zam Wesell and Jango Fett were looking for her, it took Zam hours just to find the place.
Where are you?
I'm just outside Gardulla's palace. It took me forever to find it.
And only with Jabba's help did Jango learn that you could fight your way through hordes of Tuskens, all living in the canyons that surrounded her compound, and you might be able to find an unguarded and non-sensor scanning entrance via one of the many air vents. And at the peak of their feud, the great Jabba asked for assurance from Jango that he would never give him up as the source. Jabba had only grown so bold since the silent investor and planet maker Higo Damask had come to back his push for Tatooine. This Mune banker, with the secret identity of Darth Plagueis, had previously agreed to finance Gardulla's takeover 30 years earlier, in 67 BBY.
I plan to make a grab for Tatooine, Magister, and I've come to solicit your support.
And he joked that this investment must be for one hell of a moisture farm, but she explains that it could become home to the best pod racing course in the galaxy.
A pod race course that will make those on Malastair and on your own Munilins seem like amateur runs.
The Bunta Eve Classic would provide the biggest bunta to the economy that Tatooine had ever seen, especially concentrated in the nearest city, Mos Espa. Excellent eateries and merchants to meet the needs of the tourist, racers, and their entourage, and more junk shops than a Jawa could dream of. But this also changed the spirit of the city, as entrepreneurs were able to leverage the hype around this boom. But if things went wrong, loans became debt, and out here, debt could become slavery. Mix that with the Hutt's vast off-world slave markets, and this town that prided itself on living away from the likes of Zerka Corps and Coruscant found the slave row growing exponentially over the years. Most of them were owned by the Hutts, and then sold off to work in many of the businesses throughout Mos Espa, though even moderately wealthy Espa Knights could afford a couple slaves. Shmi Skywalker's parents were hopeful settlers striking out against the big cities to settle in the Outer Rim, but they were kidnapped by pirates and sold into slavery to Gardulla, and then the Hutt lost them in a bet to Watto. However you ended up a slave, you likely lived in something like this. Rows upon rows of stacked housing on the outskirts of town. These homes were decent sized, considering the size of homesteaders like the Mars weren't much bigger, with Shmi's being a cozy 2-bedroom with a balcony, made of well-insulated and sturdy construction, used all over Tatooine, a simple but effective stacking of stones which were covered in mud and plaster. But the twisted form of cruelty was in the sludge fuel system. In a galaxy where gonks were ubiquitous, the homes in the slave quarters were on a centralized power system operated by the Hutts. It too was efficient in its own way, being bio-waste, but it wasn't like you could pop a squad over a generator and get it pumping yourself. The bioconverter fuel system that powered the home came through things like gas lines, and could be throttled to control the use by slaves, or completely cut off if you wanted to punish them. And just in case you thought about smuggling yourself off-world or running off into the canyons, they had a plan for that.
All slaves have a transmitter placed inside their body somewhere.
Any attempt to escape,
and they blow you up. Boom!
But if you weren't a slave packed with a secret exploding chip that you hoped didn't accidentally go off when you were hyperwaving your popcorn, if you were a freeman, you might like that you were not automatically entered into the Republic's genetic database. Nobody extracted a blood sample at birth, which is what Qui-Gon is referring to when he explains how such a powerful boy went undetected.
Had he been born in the Republic, we would have identified him early.
Through this pod race course would be the first time many of the galaxy at large would ever hear of this world, and as Gardulla's power grew, Plagueis secretly began backing her rival, Jabba, ensuring he was the source of power no matter what happened between these backstabbing slugs. When Jango did feed Gardulla to her own Krayt Dragon, it cut off Tatooine's involvement in a particularly deadly version of Death Sticks, and allowed Jabba to be called by names like the Absolute Overseer, Lord of the Underworld, and Daimyo, All cities paid tribute to him, and he would keep the peace and back all contracts. He was the law and the only one outside it. A system that actually worked out well here, noted by 88 and Fennec Shand as the time-honored and proven system.
I do not torture.
Respectfully, Lord Fett, on Tatooine, you must project strength if you are to be accepted as a daimyo.
And we do see that even hothead, powerful thugs like Sebulba wouldn't dare kill a slave owned by someone else. And when Watto tries to back out of the bet with Qui-Gon, hoping he wouldn't know what to do about it in this rough outpost, as soon as he says he'll get the Hutt authorities involved, Watto's fear forced him to obey the law without further protest.
Would you like to discuss it with the Hutts?
When Boba tried to change this, doing away with the fancy litter and slave attendants, he was ambushed in the streets, and even after reaching out to speak to the city leaders on equal terms, they just saw it all as weakness and opportunity. These areas dominated by different species is pretty natural, as settlers would come in large groups, want to live nearby, and set up businesses for their needs and in their language, creating neighborhoods of certain species, and smaller level crime families arose from each. As they saw their opportunity with the weaker Bib Fortuna, a man not backed by the ancient empire of the Hutts, he worked a deal with the most powerful three families to divide parts of Mos Espa.
The Trandoshans took the city center, the Aquilish, the workers' district here, and the Clatoonians, the Starport and Upper Sprawl.
Each had their own advantage, with the center likely having better access to political power and better shops and homes, while controlling the workers' district could provide them with plenty of leverage on everyone else, while the spaceport was the most obvious chokehold on the city. These areas connected to the pit via a ton of these elevators, massive and which would have been able to move livestock and ships, but with the spaceport itself being really primitive. Just a flattened out hard piece of the desert, which could accommodate large cargo and transport ships. All would have deferred to the power of the daimyo, except for the movements of the new cartel hoping to take over. The Pikes saw this as their chance to rise above all the other feuding syndicates by controlling the entire Spice Triangle along with Kessel, to create a complete monopoly of all spice trade across the galaxy. It's funny to think that 40 years earlier, and in part to their credit for all their evils, the Trade Federation didn't work in the spice biz. There was an official Trade Federation report that read that Tatooine was of no financial interest, being a, quote, vice-ridden world of no immediate importance. So that's it for Mos Espa, but you definitely want to hear these cool facts and behind-the-scenes stuff. It's funny to hear how Watto, who keeps slaves and doesn't treat them all that well, is very aware of the Outer Rim stigma. And while making this, I thought about something I never really considered about the food here, and really in all of the moderately sized cities in Star Wars, is that it all must have tasted really bland or basic. It all looks exotic, but there's a funny rule which I couldn't find the name of. If you know it, please comment down below. But think about a family of 5, that if one kid is lactose intolerant or allergic to something like peanuts, then it's easier for the parents to just make meals that don't contain any of the ingredients that only bother that one kid. So all 5 are affected by that dietary restriction. Similarly, if you wanted to have a lucrative business, you gotta find foods that can be eaten by a bunch of different species. It could never be too exotic or specialized. Imagine all the different palates and allergies. You'd have to find a middle point of all these different food interests, which might be the equivalent of making something like unseasoned chicken. What's really cool is that what we see in the Book of Boba comes from the concept art from the Phantom Menace. This was always what Mos Espa was supposed to look like, but for the story, Qui-Gon wanted to go on the outskirts. Local lore has 2 really cool ghost stories. A mysterious ship called the Dusty Duck that we did a whole video breakdown on. Its abandonment was really strange and freaked out the locals. And the spooky droid Nobot, also known as the Ghost Droid, that seemed to wander aimlessly all throughout the city, and it collected a ton of rumors, with some saying that they could sense an evil spirit or the dark side of the Force coming from it, that it committed many of the unsolved murders around the town, and that no one had been able to stop it. The real-world location was in Tunisia, but as of 2013, it said that a lot of the sets were about to be buried under the encroaching sand dunes. And a lot of this information comes from the Secrets of Tatooine, Star Wars Encyclopedia, Species Guidebook, and the Atlas. If you made it this far, please just hit that like button. It's the best way to help me out. Leave a comment with any questions and suggestions, and subscribe if you want to see more. Be sure to check out the links down in the description, and special thanks to our supporters over on Patreon, especially our $25 tier, Bill Payne, Oscar Jones, and Renee Flores. But most important of all, remember, get your gonking off the grid, and the Force will be with you, always.